button. Excellent. So this webinar, like all 6 webinars this week for Emerald Ash Borer Awareness Week, is being recorded and will be posted to the Don't Move Firewood YouTube channel, and it will also be available on the Don't Move Firewood website, as well as, I believe, the Emerald Ash Borer University website, who helped us promote and organize this webinar series. This week, we are doing 6 different topics on Emerald Ash Borer in order to make sure that all the different facets that people are interested in are hopefully represented in our webinar series. And let me just go to the next slide. There we go. So we do have 3 days, but only 2 of them fit on the slide. So for days 1 and 2 this morning, we had a really great presentation on ash tree breeding and resistance to Emerald Ash Borer. That recording will be up certainly by mid next week, if not sooner. This afternoon, we are going to be hearing from Emma Hudgins, formerly of Canada, but now of University of Melbourne. And then tomorrow, friendly reminder, we will be doing 2 more that you are free to sign up for. The Meet the Don't Move Firewood team and learn how you can be involved is the morning webinar. And then the afternoon webinar is an on-site management. After Emerald Ash Borer, Can I Save My Trees? Webinar by Bob Brunner with Purdue University. Make sure to please sign up for each separately. The link is different for each one. And as you can see on this slide, the way that we're running all of these approximately is about 40 minutes for presentation, give or take, and then the remainder of the time, so about 15 minutes to do Q&A. And again, you can try to put your Q&As into the Q&A and put your name or any like technical issues or anything like that in the chat. That helps us stay organized. So with that, I am going to give this to Emma Hudgins. I'm going to unshare my screen. And Emma, please introduce yourself and take it away.
Thanks so much, Lee. How are we looking?
It's great. It's full screen. Okay. Looks good.
Awesome. Awesome. Great. Thank you all for being here today. My apologies. It's 7 a.m. for me, so it's a little early to be speaking to you all, but I'm super glad to be here and hoping to share some of my more recent work, more generally looking at forest pests in the US and their impacts on street trees, but then focusing in on EAB and what I found for large-scale management priorities to save our street trees. So I want to start by acknowledging the work I'm discussing today was done on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, and I'm now speaking to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So as Lee said, this work was done while I was in Canada as a PhD student at McGill and then a postdoc at Carleton University. I did it in really close collaboration with some scientists at the USDA Forest Service. And now I'm at the University of Melbourne. I started in this past September, hoping to share some of the insights for biosecurity in Australia. So in order to talk to you about the management prioritization work I've done for EAB, I need to first discuss some of my earlier economic impact work that I did for street tree losses across all US forest pests. And of course, I found that Emerald Ash Borer did win out as the biggest impactor of those US street trees. So then afterward, I'll touch on how to best minimize these impacts based on modeling work that I've done at large scales across the US. So you may have seen this map. It's from Sandy Leopold, and it's the species richness of forest pests across the US. It's a little bit older now. It's from 2013, but the general pattern is roughly the same. So we see most of the forest pests in the Northeast and along the West Coast. And this coincides where most of the people are, where most of the income is, and where a lot of the tree diversity is. So looking at this map, I started wondering how we might use more general approaches to forecast the spread of all forest pests at the same time, because they seem to be moving in these really similar ways across all species. And I was particularly interested in this because for forest pests in the US, we don't actually have that many year-to-year spread records. So for most of them, we really just have an idea of the counties that they're present in now and how long they've been in the US. And for a handful of species, we might have some more year-to-year spread records. Forest pests in the US span a variety of life histories. So they include wood borers like emerald ash borer, but they also include defoliators like the spongy moth, sap feeders like the Balsamolia delgid, and pathogens like chestnut blight fungus. So these species span a super broad range of the evolutionary tree. So I was really relying on the fact that their life history at large scales wouldn't be as important as that human movement process, because that's the piece that's going to be redundant across species that have these really different life histories. So I was really interested in creating a single model, assuming that all pests were spreading in roughly similar ways up to the present date, to try to reconstruct their past spread trajectories in order to forecast their future spread trajectories. And throughout my work, I was always most interested in street trees because I knew from previous economic impact work that this was the group of species that was going to be the most costly to manage. So there are trees that are more actively managed. And I was also interested from an urban well-being context for understanding how we might better adapt to climate change and make best use of our urban canopy. And of course, we know that emerald ash borer has been devastating for trees across North America, in part due to historical planting regimes where really we're seeing a monoculture where once EAB gets in, we can see 95% mortality across 5 to 10 years. So I was really keen to figure out how we might prevent impacts to more of these street trees and learn from past invasions to better manage future invasions. So as I mentioned, this first economic impact assessment was done in collaboration with some USDA Forest Service scientists, Frank Koch and Mark Ambrose, and I worked on it during my PhD, which I did at McGill with Brian Leon. This analysis combined 3 different subcomponent models to produce cost estimates of forest pest impacts. So the first was understanding where street trees were across the US. The second was understanding how those street tree populations were going to intersect with future spread forecasts for different invaders. And then finally, given that I had these projections of interactions between pests and street trees, how many of those interactions were actually going to lead to tree death? So then putting those 3 layers together, I would be able to get an understanding of how many street trees were expected to die. And then with some rough estimates of tree removal and replacement costs by tree size classes, I could get some economic impact estimates. To start with, I had to extrapolate from this urban tree inventory database that Mark and Frank had been collating for over 10 years. And so they had over 600 communities that mostly had been reporting their street trees using iTree, so it was fairly easy to combine them together into a single database. But they still weren't entirely representative of the entire US. So my models are probably going to be most accurate in the areas where we have most of these urban tree community databases. There's some pretty big gaps, but like I said, it was over a decade of work. But I needed to extrapolate from this over 600 communities to closer to 30,000 census designated places that I expected to have some street trees and predict what types of street trees were there, how big they were. I did this at the genus level because I didn't, typically the inventories are only reported to the genus level. And so we ended up with this map. This map is just a summary of all genera at the same time and all these different DBH size classes, but we had separate predictions for each of these. And street trees are not necessarily going to have the same types of models that are used to predict their distribution as native forests. So there are going to be cultural and social factors that impact where trees get planted, in addition to restrictions around which habitats these trees can survive in. So those all factored into our distributional models. The second element here was around figuring out the past spread trajectories of these various pests. And so this is where the bulk of my work was done in simulating those past spread trajectories. So I am much more on the ecological modeling side, much less a boots on the ground side. So I think you're going to get quite a wide range of talks, but really I'm providing more of that computational background. I've definitely learned a lot about the life history side along the way, but that's definitely not where my expertise is. So this simulation model worked by starting each pest off where we, at the center of their host range, if we didn't have any better information, and allowing them to spread using different equations at each time step up into the present date. So they would be starting off at different time periods. For instance, spongy moth was first introduced in the 1800s, so we had to backcast quite a lot of spread up to the present date, whereas EAB, relatively recent introduction, we only had a few time steps that we needed to simulate. So we fit a set of equations such that the simulated spread dynamics matched as closely as possible with the real invasion pattern in the present date. So we were trying to minimize the discrepancy between these two different distributions and find the parameters that best did that. And to do this, we tested a suite of different predictors, and they were related to 3 dimensions of spread. So we thought perhaps there could be factors related to past life history characteristics that could impact spread. For instance, species that could fly might spread faster than those that don't, or things that are bigger could spread faster than things that are smaller. We looked at site characteristics, so things like how many hosts were in a location, a destination site, or in a source site, and factors related to human movement. So we had predictors around human population density, income, because we knew there would be more traffic among high income areas. And we tested all of these and tried to find the minimal model that best captured spread at large scales. So we didn't try to include everything. We just included the minimal model that had roughly good forecasts across all species. And we found that actually it was not that important to include pest-related characteristics. It was actually, the best model was just related to tree density in source and destination sites, human population density, and human income, which really resonated with this idea that pests spread at the country scale. So I should mention these cells are 50 kilometers by 50 kilometers. So we're not looking at within county dynamics, it's roughly at the county scale dynamics. So we found that that spread was best predicted by a model that just included host-related information and people-related information. And this allowed us to reconstruct that spread, like I said, from the first date of the infestations we had in our data up to the present date. You can see we didn't actually have data from Arkansas in this analysis. You can also see that the spread really accelerates more in recent years and clusters around the Great Lakes and borders of Canada, which is what we see in reality as well. So this was the first component of my PhD, but from there, I knew that we could be doing better than a general model if we had made a few corrections for each species that better captured their spread. This first model was really just to see how good we could get with a single model fit to all species. But from there, I wanted to make some adjustments to ensure that I was getting some of the nuances with particular species. So for instance, I knew that for some species, we actually had better information on where they were first introduced into the US, so I could include that rather than starting the pest off at the center of its host range. And I also knew that for some species, there were climatic limitations to where it could get to. One species that was really important for was Hemlock woolly adelgid, which was limited by cold winter temperatures. And so we were able to include those additional corrections for each species. In general, for species where we didn't know why we were fitting them a little bit worse than others, we did know that we were getting either a little bit too fast or a little bit too slow with our spread. So for those, we were able to just bring that spread up or down, but we wouldn't be able to say which factors were actually responsible for that spread being off in terms of spread rate. And we did this for a set of species where we actually had that time step by time step information, so we could validate that we were actually able to do better forecasts by doing this adjustment. So for things like Hemlock woolly adelgid, we actually did have time step by time step distributional information, and we could say fit up to the year 2000 and then forecast where it got to in 2005. And that's how we validated that it was actually improving our predictive ability into the future. So this allowed us to get to this next stage of having that future insect spread. So this is the number of new infestations of pests that were already present in the US, but they hadn't got to various cells in our simulation by the end of the forecasting window, which was 2050 in this case. So we're seeing similar patterns to historical spread where we're getting a lot more infestations still in the Northeast. And just as an aside, with this project, I was also able to forecast if new pests had got in and they had similar similar impact dynamics to the pests that had gotten in previously, where they could have the most damage. So we found that the most emerald ash borer-like species that was on the horizon was citrus longhorn beetle. And if it were to get in and have similar impact dynamics to emerald ash borer, it could cause $5 billion in damages over the next 30 years. That's a big if, and there are lots of reasons why it might not have the same impact dynamics, but we're able to just visualize which ports would have the greatest impacts. So we're actually finding that if it gets in via Louisiana, we could have worse impacts than other areas. So it allows us to inform some of that inspection level prioritization effort. So just coming back to that street tree abundance, we have predictions of future pest spread, we have predictions of future tree distributions, and putting them together, we get this map of potential interactions between pests and trees. And at this point, we don't actually know what the impact pattern is going to look like because we don't know how many of those interactions are actually going to lead to tree mortality. To use an additional database, and this was a database from Kevin Potter and colleagues, who characterized the top 5 threats to each tree species in the US and gave rough estimates to how deadly those threats were. And so some of these bins were really wide, for instance, 25 to 95%. But what they found is that most species are actually not very impactful at all. So we have this really big, really tall bin that's much less than 1% mortality rate. And then we have a few species that are super, super impactful. So that's going to be species like EAB. So I had to fit a curve to this distribution to get better estimates, particularly for these really wide bins of 25 to 95%. And so we did this, and that allowed us to really capture that full range of uncertainty in those mortality estimates and provide a range of mortality estimates for each of those pest species. I will say that the range of mortality estimates for things like EAB is actually pretty small because we have a good understanding that it's going to be really high. But for species in this range, we have much lower certainty. And putting all of this together, what we found for 2020 to 2050 is that 1.5 million street trees are expected to die due to the full set of forest insect pests, and that this would cost roughly $31 million a year just in terms of removing and replacing dead and dying street trees. Within this, we expect that 90% of that impact is going to be due to emerald ash borer. And the spatial arrangement of that impact was pretty clustered. So 94% of that mortality is expected in less than a quarter of all communities. Looking at particular hotspot communities, they're largely what we would expect in terms of being clustered at the leading edge or areas that we're already seeing high impacts that we're still going to continue to see impacts to 2050 because they haven't fully exhausted all of the street trees that they could be killing in those regions. But we also predicted this jump to the West Coast and expect there to be really high impacts in Seattle if spread continues as expected. I should say that this paper was completed before EAB got to Oregon. So I had mixed feelings when it did because I was glad that my model was useful and was predictive, but was hoping that to be wrong in that case. So just to wrap up this first section, these models were much more focused on describing business as usual and understanding general patterns and invasions at large scales so that I could inform future forecasts. But it doesn't take into account that we could change those future spread trajectories if we alter our management regimes to reduce that spread. So most of the future street tree impacts in this business as usual scenario will be due to emerald ash borer, and most impacts are going to be in urban centers in the Midwest and the Northeast, but also along the West Coast. So from there, I got interested in moving to a more prescriptive approach from a descriptive approach. So how we can change those future trajectories by altering how we're doing slow the spread type management at large scales. So I should mention this project is not focused on local scale management, things like how to do tree removal better, because we're expecting that that's not going to scale up to changing that large scale spread process. What I was really interested in is understanding how to better deploy management practices that are focused on tackling that long distance spread. And this was work that I started actually during my PhD. I did a 3-month stint in Brisbane. So it was my first introduction to living in Australia. And there's a big team of folks who work on these decision problems in Australia. And it got me interested in general in the research landscape here. And so that's partly why I'm back here. But this work was also done in collaboration with some Canadian Forest Service folks, Dennis Yemshinov and Chris McQuarrie. And I think that's likely how I got connected with Lee in the first place, because they work pretty closely together. And yeah, so I knew from the previous models that I had a forecast of how emerald ash borer was going to spread under the current scenario. And I also had estimates of where ash trees were located across the US. So I wanted to transform these predictions by integrating management decisions into my simulation models and allowing those management decisions to change the future spread projections. So I focused, like I said, on management actions that can really change long-term spread forecasts. So I was focusing on things like quarantines and the release of biological control organisms. So I was particularly motivated by the removal of the federal quarantine to understand whether this removal was going to change long-term spread forecasts, or whether the continuation of the quarantine region was going to be necessary to keep spread at bay. Because the removal of the federal quarantine, the argument was that spread was continuing, which is true, but I wasn't sure how much faster spread would have been continuing if it had never existed. So I was interested in looking at that scenario. And also, given that with the removal of the federal quarantine, the budget was going to biological control releases instead. And while these were not necessarily touted as something that could reduce spread rates at the national scale, it was kind of the only thing that the federal government, or the main thing that the federal government was funding at that point. So I was interested in how we could better position these two different management types across the US to achieve better spread rate forecasts into the future. So I set up my optimization to allow the choice of 3 different management actions in each simulation cell. So we could either focus on limiting spread into a site via a quarantine, limiting spread out of a site via focusing quarantines on exports, or deploying biological control programs in a site. And these different management actions aligned really nicely with my simulation model because I had these population growth and dispersal components in the simulation. So within the simulation, the immigration quarantines were limiting flow into sites. So we could just assume that that flow was killed, limiting dispersal out of sites. So assuming that nothing could leave, or if it left, it died with a certain efficiency. So we tested a range of different efficiencies, knowing that quarantines were not 100% effective. But even if we could limit 30% of what was leaving a site, how would that translate into federal level spread? And with biological control, we also had a lot of uncertainty about the level of population density reduction that was possible, but we modeled a variety of different potential efficiencies for this at the local scale. So basically, biological control was knocking down the population, and that would eventually translate to less dispersal out of a site, because that dispersal is linked to how many things are in there to disperse. One interesting element for me as an ecological modeler is that parasitoids themselves are spreading. So we knew that we had to model this process alongside emerald ash borer spreading. And this is actually part of the plan, where parasitoid release is done such that they can establish at a site and then move on to other sites and control EAB in those surrounding areas. And we had some estimates from the MAP Biocontrol project, and there were folks at APHIS that helped me get the data for this to understand where we felt like parasitoids had already been established based on recapture data, and also how far they had been dispersing between sites. And it seemed like a pretty good estimate is that they can disperse across those 50-kilometer cells actually within 5 years, because we were seeing 10 kilometers a year as the spread rates that we were observing, and that there was this population growth within a cell that allowed them to eventually achieve that effectiveness. And we just have a rough estimate in there and tested sensitivity to that in terms of what our outcomes were for spread at the country scale. So I'm just going to walk you slowly through this plot because it's a little bit challenging. So on the y-axis, we have the number of ash trees over 30 years that I expect to get exposed to emerald ash borer. So higher on this y-axis is worse. And here I'm comparing what I found for the optimal spatial arrangement of management actions with management actions that only involve biological control. So the filled circles are using a combination of biological control and quarantines, and the unfilled circles are only using biological control across space. But in all cases, I was testing every possible combination of locations to deploy those different management actions, and accounting for the fact that once you deploy them, they're going to impact future spread. So there's trillions of combinations of sites where you could enact management, and they all have different impacts on future spread. So we were using this programming approach that figured out what the optimal spatial arrangement of that management is. And so we found that consistently using a combination of quarantines and biological control always resulted in better outcomes for pest spread in terms of exposing fewer ash trees to emerald ash borer. And in the worst case scenario, relying only on biological control, for instance, when biological control was only 10% effective, so it's only knocking down that population by 10%, compared to quarantines, if they could be 90% effective, then there could be 1 million additional ash trees that are getting killed in the next 30 years that wouldn't have otherwise been killed. So really, the use of both approaches is a means of slowing down that impact and allowing communities time to respond to emerald ash borer and not causing this massive mortality in a short period of time. But we're not entirely sure about that 1 million number because that's the worst case scenario. So there are some scenarios, for instance, if biological control can actually knock the population down by 50% and quarantines are only 30% effective, then we see a much smaller difference between those two scenarios, but we do still see an improvement if we rely on a combination of quarantines and biological control relative to only relying on biological control. And so this 1 million street trees is also about $600 million in management spending that could be averted in the next 30 years. So this is just showing a wider range of the scenarios. So what I was interested in looking at the standard spatial management practices. So in this left-hand panel, I'm looking at if we didn't use this programming approach to figure out the best spatial arrangement of management actions across time, and we just did the typical slow the spread measure of looking at the leading edge or the sites that were going to have the greatest outflow of propagules at the next time step. So not taking this long range approach to management, but just looking in the next time step, which sites do we think are going to cause the most spread and managing those. And so we found that these filled circles where we were doing that compared to the optimized approach in the diamonds was always worse. So there really is a big benefit to looking at the long range solutions and employing these programming approaches that account for the fact that certain sites, while they might look really good for managing in the short term, they could be really easily reinvaded. And one reason why this can happen is because of that role of human population flow between major urban centers. So we were seeing that some of the best sites to manage for quarantines were actually not along the leading edge, but they were actually sites where we were restricting outflow from high human population density sites. So focusing not necessarily just on those traditional leading edge type areas, but also sites that have a lot of traffic between them. So looking at the optimal spatial management practices on the right-hand side, we see that we can actually get really close to the overall optimum if we spend roughly 20% of our budget on biological control and 80% of our budget on quarantines. We actually don't do that much worse if we don't spend any of the budget on biological control across any of my scenarios, but we see really similar savings in terms of EAB exposed ash trees over the next 30 years for all the way up to 80% of the budget being spent on biological control and 20% on quarantines. But across the board, we're seeing that that combination of approaches is likely the safest option. Looking spatially, this kind of highlights my point about high human population density sites and how those are impacting our projections. We're finding that the best places to manage are not necessarily areas along the historical quarantine border, which I'm showing in purple, but actually areas of really high human population density that are currently highly impacted by EAB. And we're also seeing the deployment of more effort into the West Coast, particularly setting up quarantines in and around Washington and allowing biological control budgets to be prioritized towards the Seattle area, as well as a few major cities. So the areas that we saw biological control really being continually included were major cities. And so that's probably the area where it's giving us the most bang for our buck because it's knocking down EAB in sites where we're getting high traffic. But then surrounding those with quarantine sites is really what's going to be optimal in the long term. And once we knock EAB populations down further, for instance, in 2045, biological control is no longer really shown on the maps based on the fact that there isn't really any red still up there. And these are just a list of a few cities where we're seeing biological control continually being suggested as the optimal management decision. I should mention that this map is just one of our scenarios. So this is the scenario where both strategies are not very effective. So quarantines are about 30% effective and biological control is 10% effective. So if we go back to this slide, it's the bottom scenario here. Oh, sorry, the top scenario here in the purple. So just to recap this section, we found that relying on conventional spatial approaches for management may be causing the loss of additional EAB impacted ash trees. And that's what I'm showing here on this plot, that the standard spatial management practices are actually resulting in a lot more exposed ash trees compared to our optimal solutions. So there is a really big advantage to employing these spread forecasts and looking at the long-term consequences of emerald ash borer spread, particularly when we know that human traffic is changing our spread trajectories and making it not just this expanding radial spread pattern, but there being these pockets of long distance dispersal like we're seeing on the West Coast that are really driven by human movement. The other element here is that relying on these rules of thumbs can show the benefits and really make governments need to be transparent about the cost of changing their approach. So rather than just focusing on the impacts in terms of the cost of maintaining the federal quarantine, you're also faced with the idea of what would have happened if we never had it and what's going to happen to the spread rate if it does get removed, to sort of make the case that there is a cost to that doing nothing or that removal of previous management action. So that's what I was hoping to show here. Obviously, and this is something that came through in discussions with Lee and Laurel and also Rachel Holmes when she was part of the team. I'm only looking at the federal quarantines here. So there are things happening at the state level that I did not capture in this approach. And I'm really hoping that this work can support existing initiatives that are happening at the state level and try to push for some consistency in the quarantine measures happening across states, because we're really showing that they're going to continue to be important. And I also should say that I'm not saying that biological control is not an important strategy. I think it is a tool in the toolkit, and it's going to be important for keeping ash trees around in the long term and preventing their extirpation. But in terms of allowing communities to respond and not be overwhelmed by this really high level ash mortality, I think we need to rely on a combination of these two approaches to have the maximum bang for our buck. So I've kind of blown through this, but at this point, I'd like to thank my lab at Carleton, where I did my postdoc, the lab at UQ, where I started this work, my lab at McGill, and the folks at the Forest Service, both the Canadian Forest Service and also Sandy Leopold, who helped with the earlier components of my work, and Frank Kosh and Mark Ambrose, who helped with the urban tree distribution database. And then, of course, Lee and Laurel for inviting me, and Rachel, who provided input in the earlier parts of this manuscript, and all my funders. And feel free to email me if you have questions. We'll have lots of time for questions now. You can check out my website to see what I'm up to now in Australia. And I'm just really happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emma. That was great. And I promise it's not night here. My laptop's camera is notoriously unpredictable. Well, that's great that thank you so much for such a great presentation on all the materials. And I will just say that it's always a pleasure to have more time for question and answers. So I am curious if anyone in the audience has any questions. You can put them in the Q&A, which is a little box on Zoom, or so we don't have a big rush of questions. You're also welcome to put them in the chat. And what we'll do, because you can't see those on a recording, is I will read them out loud when I see them, and then Emma will graciously answer them if she can, or say that she can't if she can't. So does anybody have any questions? And Emma, if nobody has questions, you're also very free to expound on your favorite aspect of the topic until somebody comes up with a good question.
Well, something that I've noticed, I will expound. Something that I've noticed moving to Australia, just in terms of like the difference between working in North America and working in Australia, is there's no movement restrictions on firewood in Australia, and it's very scary to me. Like you can bring it wherever you want, and I personally have brought it many kilometers away. And I guess, so the trees are obviously quite different in Australia compared to North America, and most of the firewood is native eucalypts, which don't currently have any known impactful non-native borers in them. But to me, it seems like a ticking time bomb. So that's just an interesting thing I've noticed, because moving to Australia, I really got this, or I initially had the sense, and maybe it's from the Border Security TV show, that they were quite intense about biosecurity. And I think that's true in terms of the initial introduction side. And I think they do such a good job at that inspection and introduction side that some of these secondary spread pathways, there isn't as much work going into the risk associated with them. And I think that's an area where North American forest research is really at the cutting edge.
It's really interesting. I know that they have an infestation of polyphagous shothole borer in Western Australia, and that is very easily spread in firewood. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm wondering if do you know if they have any quarantines around that infestation area?
So I don't know for sure. So my understanding of the shothole borer infestation is it's happening in non-native street trees, mostly plane trees in WA. And there aren't really any non-native trees used for firewood, but given the host breadth of that borer, there could be a risk associated with that. I can't speak to what's going on so much in WA. It's pretty far, but there are a lot of border checkpoints coming into and out of WA, mostly for agricultural pests, but they definitely do have something at that level.
Oh, that's
Within
good.
Eastern Australia, I wouldn't say there is as much movement restriction happening.
Interesting. Yeah. And for those of you not familiar, it's Western Australia is WA, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we got some Q&A rolling in now. I'm sorry if I didn't see it earlier. So let's take a quick look here. All right, let's just start at the top and we'll do what we can do.
Okay.
Patrick Porter asks, Emerald ash borer is just moving into Texas and we have a quarantine, kind of. The key is to get people to comply. In big picture terms, how much can we slow down the spread by 90% compliance with no movement of wood products out of the affected county bounded by uninfested counties. And then Patrick adds, assume no biological control in the question.
Okay. I'll try my best with that one. So based on discussions that I've had with Lee and Laurel, I think there's been quite a lot of focus on individual people's compliance with firewood movement. And I mean, it's in the name of the website, so I get that. But I think a big part of this is actually industrial compliance, and actually a lot of the wood volume that's moving between states is going to be on the industry side and sawmill side. And so that's where you can probably get most of the wood volume actually being reduced, because there's much more of an inspection. There's better governance systems in place to ensure compliance. And I think it's a lot harder to inspect individual people moving firewood. I mean, I think some key things are having clear messaging, making people understand what distance is allowed. I don't think you can ever assume to be able to get 100% compliance or even 90% compliance of firewood movement, but I think it's more about a combination of firewood compliance with industrial wood movement compliance.
And when you're talking about industrial wood movement, Emma, are you talking about lumber timber kind of movement, or are you talking about large regional firewood sellers? I'm just curious, what's your vision?
Oh, I guess probably both. But I was thinking more about lumber and timber, but large industrial firewood sellers would be a better way to have a fewer number of people that you're ensuring compliance for. And that would be more of a hub to ensure compliance. Because I think part of it is just like how distributed the problem is and how many people you have to ensure compliance from.
Yeah. And I think the trickiness of compliance is that each one of those would have a different way to increase compliance. So the timber industry would have a different mechanism and different people involved in different laws than regional firewood sellers even. And then certainly different, both of those would be different from individual human behaviors of campgrounds and personal choices to move firewood. So it is really tricky, but I agree entirely. Laurel and I have looked a lot at how consistent is messaging. And there's just at that very basic level of how consistent is the messaging to people, there's a tremendous amount of room for growth. People could really work harder on simply just making it easier to understand the messaging. And Laurel flicks her screen on.
Actually, yeah, just speaking of Texas, a state plant regulatory official in Texas just reached out to us recently because of some new, found infestations, and they're hoping to get us on board with a customized outreach strategy for them for online messaging, because again, we want to reach folks before they're actually moving it, raise awareness to be more preventative. So I'm going to dive into that with some Texas folks next week. So we're on it.
Very, very timely. Yeah. So it's really important work. It's not simple. It doesn't come naturally to have aligned, comprehensive, ubiquitous messaging for all the different people considering the movement to firewood or in the firewood industry. So this is, it's the work that we do that helps elevate that, hopefully. But yeah, it's very timely that Laurel was just talking with the state plant regulatory official of Texas 2 weeks ago. So it's perfect.
One more thing on that I guess I hope this work can do is try to make sure people haven't given up, because I think with things like EAB, there's an amount of time that people are willing to tackle it for, and then it seems like effort can wane. So I want to show that it's not too late to slow those impacts, particularly just spreading out the removal and replacement burden on municipalities.
Yeah, I think it is a really hopeful message that activities now can save huge amounts of trees in the future. I mean, it's really important to know that like the work that we're doing to slow the spread of these forest pests, you won't be able to put your finger on it in the future, but if you do it well, you will save a lot of trees. Yeah, it's awesome. All right, let's go to the next one. Speaking of which, so Fern McBride from Montana, I happen to know, asks, do you have quarantine recommendations to prevent immigration of emerald ash borer into areas that have not yet been infested? And Montana has not. The Montana Invasive Species Council is developing parameters to manage the movement of out-of-state firewood to prevent infestation.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so again, I would say that Lee and Laurel are kind of the experts on the ground policy side of this. But what I'm seeing in my models is that it's a combination of uh, export quarantine or emigration quarantines and immigration quarantines. So I don't think Montana actually came up as one of the high priority sites for the immigration side. But that's not to say that there wouldn't be benefits to immigration quarantines, especially because I was only looking at the federal budget and there would be different state budgets at play there. But I think it's coordination with states that are going to be big exporters of EAB infested materials and making sure that they have consistent quarantines in place. So part of what Laurel and Lee have been working on is understanding what types of quarantines exist across different states, how different they are. And I think it would be really important to push for some level of consistency in what type of fumigation is happening, what type of heat treatment is happening, so we have a consistent level of risk that different parties have agreed to. I think it would be hard to get back to the federal quarantine now that it's been removed, but trying to recapture the good things about it as closely as possible.
Yeah, one of the reasons that Montana likely didn't come up in your analysis is that it has an incredibly low population in respect to its neighboring states. Montana and Wyoming specifically are hovering right at the 1 million people mark. So they're just not going to show up as high priorities by the numbers.
Right.
So,
and I also don't know for the urban tree modeling side of things, how many communities in Montana we had in our database. So we might not be capturing what the ash distribution is as closely as some of the communities that are better represented.
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
I mean,
All
the
right,
other
so
thing
let's-
is, oh, sorry.
Oh, I was gonna say, let's go to the next question.
Sure.
If that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, next question. Let's hit some buttons so it's easier to read. Okay. What about nurseries? How important are they for the movement of emerald ash borer? I've heard that the latest find of emerald ash borer in Vancouver, BC may be related to nursery stock since there is no native ash trees in Vancouver, BC.
Yeah, I would say nurseries are an underappreciated pathway of secondary spread for forest pests. And they definitely are groups that need to be on board. I mean, part of that is ensuring that nurseries have access to enough stock of a variety of trees to be supplying communities with. So making sure that the messaging that we're hearing about street tree diversity is working its way into supply chains and allowing nurseries to start growing up a diverse stock of street trees so that they aren't just supplying ash trees into the future will be important, but also for those that are currently supplying ash trees, ensuring compliance and that they're mitigating risks as much as possible is going to be really important. And that's another element of quarantines from the exporters side that will be really important. So there are some approaches going forward where people are considering whether exporters should be paying sort of an insurance against the risk that they're giving to communities. So if a nursery in one state is exporting ash trees to another state and it's in an area that's got EAB, if we can't get it to a place where there are quarantines in place, there could also be some sort of payment structure or for future pests. Because part of that is just, it's really hard to ascribe the ownership over who caused the infestation when it's a nursery. But if all nurseries were kind of co-funding the risk that they're giving to communities, that's an alternative payment structure. So that's something that's being explored. I don't think it's really something that's happening in practice yet.
Yeah, and I will note that in the United States, the federal quarantine did prohibit the movement of nursery stock from inside to outside. But emerald ash borer did such a substantial amount of damage to the viability of ash trees at all within any nursery that the reduction in nursery stock was partially due to just literally the fact that there became no functional market and unhealthy stock. You know, you can't, not only was it illegal, but also you couldn't sell the unhealthy stock. There's actually vanishingly little young ash trees available for sale in the United States. I don't know about Canada. For a separate project, we recently discovered that there's essentially 2 places you can now buy ash trees on nursery stock in the contiguous United States. So I think nurseries played an enormous, unfortunately, I think they played an enormous role in the first pre-infestation movement of pre-discovery movement of emerald ash borer. So right at the beginning and right at the introduction of emerald ash borer in the Great Lakes region of the US and Canada. And then their role became much smaller with regulation and the collapse of ash trees in the nursery trade at all. But I don't know, do you know, Emma, is it currently legal or in any way not legal to move ash nursery stock across Canada?
I'm not going to say anything because I don't actually know.
You don't
I
know.
haven't
That's
heard
fine.
that it is.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I have to ask Chris.
Yeah. In the United States, it's illegal to bring potentially emerald ash borer nursery stock into most, but not all states.
Okay.
So it is not every state. And Laurel could answer the actual numbers if we gave her enough time. But the reality is that we know it's most states will not permit that legally, and a few do not have a law. So, all right. So this is great. We have one more question coming up in the Q&A, and it is from Brett McDonald. Does emerald ash borer's 1 year or 2 year life cycle? Oh, this is a really good question for a Canadian because they get to 2 year life cycles only when it's real cold. 1 year or 2 year life cycle play a significant role in management strategies where your research has taken place. For instance, specific management strategies for 1 year life cycles or different for 2 year life cycles.
Right. So though I am Canadian, I've actually been doing all of my work in the US for this just because of the FIA database and just better understanding of where the trees are. Canada struggles because they don't actually have that many validation plots for trees up north because of access issues. And that just makes this work a lot harder in Canada. But I will say I know a bit about the discovery of EAB in Winnipeg, and it's still really early to know why, like whether the initial response was just really good. I think it was something like 19 trees that they initially found EAB in, and then they removed everything from that whole neighborhood, and they haven't found anything since. That was last year, the year before. And there was discussion about whether there were a lot of woodpeckers there, and that was what was going on, but I don't think they're really panned out. So I think the dominant theory is it's a combination of the slower life cycle happening in Winnipeg and the fact that we've learned so much about how to respond to EAB now that we're doing better. So I do think, I mean, the way that you're going to respond is going to be the same, but I think you're going to be more effective if it's a 2 year life cycle. There are differences in the parasitoids and their climatic tolerances. So it's also going to change what type of biological control you can feasibly deploy in an area. And I know there are certain parts of the US, this is more on the warmer side, like areas around Louisiana where they haven't really discovered a biological control organism that can withstand that climate. So that's also an issue in the warmer side. But EAB has gotten to places that are colder than Winnipeg successfully. So it's a little bit unclear exactly what's going on. And that's the challenge with the speed of the invasion being so fast relative to our ability to understand the species biology.
Yeah, that's a great answer. One thing that I see occasionally when we talk to emerald ash borer management professionals is that taking down potentially infested trees early in an infestation over winter is a lot easier and faster because the emerald ash borer can't literally escape the area when you're cutting down the tree. So your management window is actually a little sort of simpler when you have these long lifespans, super cold winters, because you have a wider range of times where you can take the trees down and just not worry about taking a week to get rid of the debris instead of a day to get rid of the debris, because there's nothing flying out of there in the middle of winter.
Right.
So it may actually simplify both the human management and then also have biological implications.
Right. I guess just at this stage, I don't know if we can confidently say where EAB is having a 2-year life cycle and where it's not.
Yeah, I don't know either. But I do know that if it makes it in Winnipeg, it can make it almost anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's cold up there. So if anybody else has a question, we have 3 more minutes. And it's the beginning of Emma's day. She is bright and early, so she's ready for one more question if anybody has them. Oh, it is Tuesday over there.
This Tuesday, yep.
Yeah.
I will say that I have an ash tree in my yard that my parents planted when I was born, and it is still doing okay.
Nice.
But EAB is only a few kilometers away from there now, so I'm holding on.
So you've got personal stake in this too.
Yeah.
All right. Well, on that note, I hope that tree does an amazing job of surviving. And thank you all for attending, especially all those from Eastern Time that worked after 5. And we will be posting this webinar on both the YouTube channel and the Don't Move Firewood site and the Emerald Ash Borer University site, I believe. So last but not least, thanks again, Emma. And we will call this webinar to a close.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks everyone for staying late if you did.